Hey YouTube, I'm inside my greenhouse and I want you to look at something. This is a stamp on one of the 2x4 studs of the wall. I want you to look closely at this. You see where it says KDHT? Now I'm not going to talk about the stamp. I just want you to notice it says HT. That's important because that's what I want to talk about. Hey YouTube, so it's a crappy day today. It's drizzling right now and I just needed to get out of the house a little bit, so I decided I'll take Bullseye for a little walk and I'll have a talk with you about something. I had given a lecture and regrettably I didn't record it, but I had given a lecture once about drying wood, and on YouTube here, there's a lot of things that I do that never get put on tape. For one thing, sometimes they're a little bit complicated and I don't want to have to explain it, or it may not be interesting to most people. But I'm going to talk today about something that it's about drying wood, but we're going to take it to another step. So in order to have this conversation, or I guess one-way lecture here, there's a couple words that you have to know the definitions of, and that, I mean, you have to really know what they mean. So one of them is called heat treating, and that's why I made that little clip right in front of this one in my greenhouse. Heat treating is done to lumber for the specific reason of importing lumber, so that bugs, parasites, whatever, microorganisms I suppose, that are inside the wood are killed, so that they don't spread some sort of infestation somewhere else. Now, normally this occurs by heating the wood to 133 degrees, I believe it is, but I'm going to just say 130 plus, okay, for a half of an hour. Now, the core, in other words, the center of the wood, has to reach 130 before you start doing your counting, okay? So, I've done this in my greenhouse using a diesel fuel torpedo heater to get heat, and on my multimeter I have a probe. It's not a metal probe, it's just a small wire probe that you can actually drill a small hole into wood and then put the probe in. What I usually do is put the probe into, like if it's an 8-footer, I cut them 8'3", that's where I'll probe it. Somewhere in that 3-inch, right before the 8-foot mark, where I'm going to cut the board or anything. Yeah, the thing about heat treating is you can heat treat logs if you want to. You can heat treat 8x8, you know, big beams for post and beam construction. The difference is that you have to have some information from someone who's done some testing that can tell you how long it takes to heat that thing, okay? It's kind of like baking a cake, where, you know, you turn the oven on, you wait for the temperature to get up in the oven to baking capacity or whatever, and then you throw the cake in there and then it bakes. So you need to know how long to keep wood at a certain dimension, you know, the thickness. You need to know how long to keep that in 130 degrees or 133 degrees until the center of it is going to be that temperature, and then you can go ahead and do your counting of half of an hour. So that's heat treating. And like I say, it's basically for import. In other words, you're going to, export, I'm sorry, you're going to export lumber to, say, another country, and I can only hope that other countries do the same for us. Probably China lies about it. That's my personal opinion. But anyway, That's heat treating. So then the other words that you need to know, I don't know what he sees over there, he sees something. The other words you need to know, come on boy, come on, come on. The other words you need to know are kiln dried or kiln drying. Now I know I've talked a lot about the kiln and all, and here's the thing. Kiln drying only has to do with moisture content, okay? It has nothing to do with heating, for instance. So when you look, if you looked at that, the beginning of my video, I showed that stamp on lumber. It had KDHT. That means it was kiln dried as well as heat treated, okay? So what that does then is just gives you an indication of what the lumber's been through. Okay, so kiln drying is has to do with moisture content. The heat treating has to do with reaching 130 some degrees for a period of a half an hour at the core of whatever you're trying to heat treat. So, boy, I got a lot of cleaning up to do here. So anyway, that's the definition basically of those two. And then the last thing, let's see, kiln, heat. Let me just think for a second. The last thing there then would be, case hardening, which can be a result of, I don't want to say a result of both of the two previous items, but let me explain to you what case hardening is. Now, case hardening has nothing to do with temperature. Some people I've heard say that if you heat a board to a certain temperature, you'll case harden the outside. It's not the temperature that case hardens lumber. What case hardens lumber is the lack of moisture. So the faster you get the moisture away from the surface, leaving moisture in the inside of the log, the more chances you have of a case hardening. Okay? Now, case hardening can be a nuisance. For one thing, if you've ever had a straight 2x4, and I'm mostly talking softwood here because that's what I'm going to be doing a lot of cutting of. If you take soft wood and you take a 2x4 and you split it down the middle, there's a good chance that it's going to curve to one side. But I don't know if you've ever tried this. If you take a 2x6, okay, and cut a piece out of the middle of it, that piece that you cut out of the middle, let's say you cut a 2-inch section out of the middle, will in more likeliness, or more likelihood, whatever, will stay straighter than the two outside edges. The reason for that is because the inside of the wood that's been case hardened, the outer shell is hard, okay, because it's dried. That's the point. It's not even a matter of hardness. They just call it case hardened. So the outside of it is dry, and the inside has moisture in it. So when you cut the one edge off, like let's say you take a 2x4 and split it in half, you have released the case hardening on one side, and that's going to force the board to bend or to warp or to bow, whichever, you know, whatever, depending on grain. Sometimes it has to do with what's going to happen, but that's why it does that. So a long time ago I was cutting some 2x2s, and somebody said to me that they think you should leave the 2x6s or the 2x8s that I was cutting them out of whole, and then cut them later. Now that is okay if case hardening hasn't occurred, okay? But if case hardening occurred, I'm going to sit down on my bench here even though it's wet. If case hardening has occurred and you try to do that, you're only going to have warped spindles, okay? So that's why that occurs because of case hardening. I'll give you a perfect example of case hardening and where it becomes a real nuisance. If you're a carpenter and you've done a lot of framing, tell me how many times in your life you've come upon a skid of 2x4s or an order of 2x4s that just don't want to be nailed on the edge. I'm going to shut the camera off for a second because there's a truck coming. Okay, so the trucks went by. So again, what I'm saying about case hardening, if you've ever had 2x4s that no matter how hard you try to toenail them suckers to the bottom plate, they always split. That's a perfect example of case hardening. That's why I used to buy a certain brand of 2x4 studs, because when certain places you have to do toenailing, you can't nail through the bottom plate into the edge of the board or end of the board. So you need to have lumber you can do that to. I mean, a lot of times you'll notice that, especially lumber, once it's case hardened, you cover it up, you come back 3 years later, 5 years later, and you want to take that, like take a couple 2x4s out to maybe put a window in, and you try and use those 2x4s, those suckers are as hard as a brick, because what's happened is the case hardening is got intense on them, and they just can't drive a nail in them. But anyway, that's just one thing I was, to give you an example of case hardening. So think of case hardening then as, think of it as like a loaf of bread, where the outside is nice and crispy, crunchy, but the inside is moist. That's what case hardening is. It doesn't have to be a certain hardness. It doesn't have to be even a certain temperature to achieve it. All it has to do is have a lot less moisture on the outside, or a rapid loss of moisture on the outside of the wood and a lot of moisture on the inside yet, in order for case hardening to occur. Now, is case hardening a defect? Well, it depends on what you're doing. If you're going to be ripping it down and working it, yes, because you'll have all kinds of warped boards. If I take a 1x4 and let's say I'm going to plane it down to a piece of base molding, I'll end up probably with a pretzel if that piece of board, if that board is case hardened. So when you're, and the difference between like case hardening, you got to just remember that it has to do with how much moisture comes off the surface. And what happens is it gets so hard that it doesn't really allow moisture to come from the inside out of it anymore. And now, like I say, don't think of hardness as something like rock hard. Think of it more as like a plastic wrap, where, first it was wrapped in paper, then it was wrapped in wax paper, now it's wrapped in plastic wrap. Okay, that's sort of a rough way of explaining how case hardening occurs. All right, so then, with that said, understanding how these different things occur and what you need to do to make them happen. Like I say, for heat treating, a lot of people say, well, you got to heat treat pine to kill the bugs in it. Well, you can heat treat it, or you can use a chemical to do it. The problem with using the chemical is then you might be liable for anything the chemical may cause. Just off the cuff, some kid sucking on a piece of wood that's on a windowsill. I mean, I'm sure you've seen little kids do it. I did it as a kid myself. I can remember the taste, actually, and my mom slapping me on the head telling me to stop that. But anyway, I guess my wood fetish started way back. But I'm just saying, if you use a chemical to do it, and you can, the chemical, you want to make sure that you're not setting yourself up to be sued for some kind of nonsense, But anyway, you can case harden wood with no chemical at all, just by drying it rapidly. Now, luckily last year, for all the rain we had, the lumber that I have in my kiln has dried down to 6%. And I know it's not case hardened, and the reason I say that, now you would think it would be at 6%, but the reason I say it's not is because it took so long to happen. We kept and the one way to reverse case hardening is to add water. Not a mist, but a lot of water. In other words, if you have case hardening, you can literally soak a 2x4 in water and relieve that case hardening. Okay, the idea of drying wood is to get the center, like a sponge for instance. The idea is that the outside dries enough to pull moisture from the inside and allow it to evaporate. That's the premise of drying. Case hardening is when, like I say, you dry the outside so quickly that the inside can't get the moisture out of it, and it just sort of retains it. Now it does it at a lower moisture content than what you would get if you cut a tree, you know, just recently cut a tree down, but it can do it at almost any moisture content as long as the outside is a lot drier than the inside. Stop it! Go in the woods! So anyway, those are a couple things that I thought that you might want to know about. And you know, some of the things like with kiln drying, you can kiln dry wood like in the solar kiln, and if you're down south, you're having all dry, very low humid, you know, weather, you could case harden. And case hardening, by the way, is not limited to softwood. It's hardwood and softwood can be case hardened. Although because of the difference between hardwood and softwood, they might act differently as you use them. However, when you work them, you'll know if it's case hardened as soon as it warps when you cut it. And that would be the defect in case hardening. If you have case hardened 2x4s and you're studding out something and you're using a nail gun to, you know, to nail, I don't see a real big problem with it. Now if you're toenailing, yeah, but that's not really a bad issue for studding. But if you take these same boards, like say you're using nice white pine boards and the outside's case hardened, and like I said, you try and cut molding or you try to do any kind of cutting, as soon as you cut it, especially the length, you are going to end up with it warping, twisting, cupping, whatever. Okay, all the things that you don't want it to do is what it's going to do. So that's where case hardening can be an issue. And a lot of times when I owned a lumber mill, or a lumber yard rather, you know, when you talk to people like from Georgia Pacific, for instance, who really know a lot about this. Let me shut this off again for the car. Sorry about that, but what I was saying is when you talk to people, like when I would talk to people from Georgia Pacific who knew something about lumber, and believe me, some of these guys are amazing, they would tell you, look, we've got a load of lumber here, got case hardened, we'll give it to you for a good price, can you use it? Well, you know, depending upon what was happening with it, yeah, I'd buy it. I mean, to be honest with you, a customer doesn't know if something's case hardened or not case hardened until they start cutting it. So, you know, I was just hoping that they'd use it for something that would be, you know, like where they'll use the whole board. Like if you cut it 1x12 across the grain and you use it for, say, in a closet, a shelving or something, you won't notice so much of that problem as you will if you're going to rip it and, you know, cut it into pieces to make something. So those 3 points are something that I think should be understood once you reach the point where you're questioning, why am I not able to cut these boards without them warping? That is probably your main issue because of the way it was dried. Now, like I say, to offset hardening, you can introduce moisture to it, to the outside of the board. And how you do it, you know, there's a number of ways, I guess, to do it. It's up to you. It's something that you will need to put it rapidly. A couple months ago, I made a video about a pumpkin I cut out with red oak, and I showed you how when it dried on one side, it cupped. When I put moisture on it, it returned flat, and then I left moisture on it, and now the boards are dry. They're both dry, and they're both as flat as a pancake because of me manipulating the moisture and drying of the board. And you can do the same thing with boards. However, the better thing to do is to, because you can't, I mean, let's face it, trying to do every board, you may have boards on the outside edges of a skid of lumber being case hardened, you know, and the inside not. So, you know, it would be hard to be pulling out all the boards trying to make a specific thing happen. So the best thing to do is have the good practices from the start and keep track of how fast things are drying. That's why you see me going into the kiln a lot of times. You know, it's difficult to explain all of this on a video like this. It's better if I'm in a classroom, but the point is that this is things that you need to know. And once you start to understand those things, which is the next step in drying and having good lumber, and that's the whole point. When you're done, you want to have usable, good lumber. You know, I got a comment the other day from someone who was telling me that when they buy lumber at a local store, sometimes it's not as good as what it is, or sometimes it's better at a small mom and pop store than it is from a big box store. And that's because there's nobody at the big box store watching the skids of lumber coming in. They could care less. Mom and pop, they get an opportunity to talk to people who understand this, and if they're, you know, into it like I am, and then you'll get to know what to buy and what not to buy. And you can question them on these things, and they can tell you how, you know, the process that it took to dry something. And that's all really important if you're going to have a quality product that you want to sell. I mean, I'm sure if you have a cabinet maker and you're going to sell them wood that has been case hardened, soon you're not going to have a customer. So you have to be able to keep track of how you're drying this stuff. Now, the different ways of drying and how you keep track of it, I'll talk about in a later video. But here's the one thing that I was saying before. If you take like a 4x4 and you put it into a place that you're going to heat to 130 degrees because you want to heat treat it. Now remember, heat treating, case hardening, and kiln drying are three different things. They have really nothing to do with one another other than they're related to the wood. Okay? They're three different separate entities that take place for three different reasons. And you need to remember that. Alright, so anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, about the testing. So you can test for heat treating, I want to get back to the heat treating, by using a probe, drilling a hole into a piece of wood. Now you don't want to be drilling bunches of holes in the center of 2x4s or nice 1x. What you want to do is try and do it when it's like when you have ends that are going to be cut off to square up a board, or something that you're not going to use, that you can trim off somehow, or if a sacrificial board, that would be another way of doing it. So anyway, like I said, I use a kerosene heater, a torpedo heater, to heat my greenhouse. I can get it up to 130 without an issue, and then I can keep it there for as long as I need to. And then I use a probe, like I said, from a multimeter, to put the probe down into the wood to let me know whether this thing is actually doing what it's supposed to do or not. So I'm just saying and trying to explain and pass on some of this other stuff. It gets more technical than that, and you can, you know, there's a lot of comments on these different things out there. But let me just tell you something. The same way you don't need someone to tell you when you're hungry or not, man has good senses. You know, we have our eyes, we have our fingers, we have the different senses that, you know, smell. We know, we can tell what's going on if you're observant. And that's the whole point. You have to be really observant and then test your observation out to find out if that was really what took place. Okay? That's one of the things that's that I find that most people don't do. They see something, like a carpenter will cut a board down the middle and say, why is this warping? Why are all these boards warping? Well, now you know why they warp. And that's part of, you know, the issue with working with things like that. I find that most 2x4s and most framing lumber has been case hardened because a lot of it is surface dried and not kiln dried. down to 19%. But not always, you know. And like I say, case hardening when it comes to framing lumber may or may not be an issue. Okay, once it's nailed together, I don't care how case hardened it gets, because the harder the wood is when it's nailed together, the stronger it is. But it's just sometimes, you know, working it and getting it to where you need it is the issue. Bullseye. Come on, we're gonna walk down. It's starting to rain a little bit harder now. Alright guys, so I hope that doesn't bore you too much. If you have any questions about that, you can ask them in the comments. I'll answer as best I can. Oh, we're getting some wind here now. Have a good one. Well, like always, I just thought of something else to say. So let me add this. I don't even know if I said this before, but I just want to tell you this, explain this to you. Heat treating. Remember heat treating. The definition is getting it up to 133, I believe it is, for half an hour. Heat treating can be done regardless of what the moisture content is in the piece of wood that you're trying to work with. Whether it be an entire log, a 12 by 12, an 8 by 8, 4 by 4, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the moisture content is. So that means that you could heat treat lumber when it's a log. You don't necessarily have to heat treat it after you've cut it into 2x4s. So you could, if you can keep the area you're trying to heat treat in hot enough for a long enough period of time, you could heat treat an entire log. Okay, now kiln drying, you can dry something down to a certain moisture content, and it doesn't matter how much heat you have or don't have. Okay, you don't have to have heat to dry wood, as long as you have a moisture, an environment that's lower in moisture than what the wood is. Bullseye! Come on, boy. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. He's having some problems with his one leg. We haven't even got any leaves yet on the trees, although my forsythia are starting to show some good signs. Thing is, it's supposed to snow on Sunday. Today, it's Friday today. It's supposed to snow Sunday a little bit. Probably snow showers. Well, there's a nice hemlock growing. By the time I'm about 140, I'll be able to cut that sucker up.